Welcome to the RCG-enabled Banking AML investigation solution. First, we're going to talk about the use case. Here are some insights about the industry. That's a good place to start. The penalties for non-compliance with government regulations has gone up very steeply in the first 15 years of this century. 1 in every 10 financial services organizations, that's what the FSO stands for, have been pulled up for some kind of violation in 2016. Hiring investigators to look into these violations and money laundering activities is not cheap for the banks. Just the salary alone is about $75,000, and that doesn't include the total loaded cost. You will notice these arrows that help walk through the customer with this dialogue. That's what I'll be using a lot. Banks have operational systems that contain core data, which by law need to be passed on to a transaction monitoring system, which then generates some portion of those transactions as alerts. And once again, by law, those alerts need to be formed into cases and managed as the investigation proceeds. For the purpose of this demonstration, we have here a sample data set that consists of 12,000 accounts in different lines of business, like personal, commercial, and so on, that are owned by a grand total of 10,000 parties. A party is nothing but an individual or a business, a company. Let's say, for example, we have 1 million transactions over some period of time, let's say a week or a month, depending upon the volume of business that bank does. And let's say for a second that roughly 7.1% of those are kicked out as alerts by the transaction monitoring system, which means that roughly 92% of them are non-alerts. Just a couple of things here to point out. Some of the more popular transaction monitoring systems out there are Actimize from NICE Systems, Mantis from Oracle, and Norcom from BAE Systems. There are others as well, including homegrown systems, but you are most likely to encounter these as you go out into the marketplace. The alerts are then basically bundled into cases and handled and managed via the case management tool. For the sake of simplicity, we just said each alert becomes a case. That is not always the case, but and we will come back to this later. And a small number of those end up as what we call SARs, which stands for Suspicious Activity Reports. So these are reported back to the government here in the United States. So the questions that we are trying to address, a tip here, sometimes you will see that the zoom level is not appropriate on these things, so you may have to quickly zoom out or zoom in, as the case might be. So the questions we're trying to answer is, are all of those truly non-alerts? Meaning, are there things falling through the cracks or false negatives that are really making the bank non-compliant? Do all of these alerts really need investigating, or can something be done there in terms of automation to sort of ease the burden? And extending that concept, do all these cases again really need to be investigated, or can we consolidate alerts down to a lower number of cases and or perform auto closing of cases, if you will? Those are the questions that our solution will address. The first step in our solution is what we call party resolution. What this basically means is banks have lists of individuals and businesses that own accounts, or they could be parties outside the bank with whom the bank account holders are transacting business. So we want to get a sort of a clean list, if you will. So just because we have a grand total of 10,000 parties does not necessarily mean that there are 10,000 unique parties. By going through the process of party resolution, we want to determine how many of these are unique. I'll take just a couple of very specific examples here. You see this entry called Benjamin Summers and Alan B. Summers. These are basically two representations of the same name, and you can see that this guy has 5 accounts. So by going through party resolution, I've been able to consolidate everything down to his formal name along with all the other aliases that I see from these systems, right? And I'm able to consolidate the number of accounts. That's an error, it is going to be fixed. The other thing that also happens as part of party resolution is it allows the banks to do more robust risk segmentation. Notice how Al Summers here, all his 3 accounts have been classified as being at a low risk level, whereas Benjamin Summers, the 2 accounts under that name are medium. In our system or solution, we have a rule that states use the highest risk category, right? The rule can be configured any way you want. So therefore, as a result of it, all those 5 accounts for Ben Summers or Alan Summers have now been classified at a medium. Here's a couple of other things to note as well. This was probably a pretty obvious example where, in this case, Alan is his true first name, the B stands for Benjamin, sometimes he goes by Ben, a lot of people go by their middle names, but look at this collection of records here. Max Eisenhardt, or Max J. Eisenhardt, presumably the J stands for Jacob, but look at this, Eric Lenscher, an incomplete name that probably means Michael. So what we're able to do is to use a number of other attributes, such as their address and even better, email IDs, IP addresses from where they're conducting their online activity, etc., and bringing together all these identities and grouping them under this one called Max J. Eisenhardt. Is this suspicious? I don't know yet. I mean, we don't have enough information yet to deem that as being suspicious activity. However, applying the same rule, this entity or party now has been awarded a risk level of high. More on that to come as we go further down in the solution. So to summarize, we are addressing fundamental data quality with name and address, and additional attributes is available, such as email addresses, such as social security numbers or business tax ID numbers, IP addresses, etc. Just make that much richer. In our example, the 10,000 records have now been boiled down to 6,000 distinct parties. That's what party resolution has done for me. Extending the concept, moving on to what we call event management. Now that I have a better idea of who these parties are, like we just saw in the party resolution, this now helps me do certain things, such as I could have had, let's say that my transaction monitoring system has a rule that says anybody that has a low risk account, their transactions, unless they violate other rules, are generally not considered to be an alert. However, because of doing a better job of risk segmentation, if I now have a rule in my TMS that says anybody that has a risk classification of medium or higher than medium, I want all of their transaction activity to be marked as an alert, regardless of anything else. So what this has now done for me is I have now interfered with the event detection process and generated a number of additional alerts, which is then reflected in what this number represented is the number of non-alerts. That number has now gone down by roughly 600 in my example. In other words, I have pushed a bunch of events from the non-alerts line into the alerts line. So party resolution has naturally led me to event management and therefore do a much better job of keeping the banks more compliant, because if they had allowed these transactions to just fall through as non-alerts, they might risk being out of compliance. Let's take this one step further, what we call pattern analysis. Remember, when we moved about 600 of those non-alerts and made them into alerts, just watch the behavior here. We will see that the number of alerts now went up, which means there are more investigations that need to be conducted. So this is where pattern analysis comes in, where I can now use data and analytics to consolidate this number of alerts into a smaller number of cases so that my investigative burden is less. So first and foremost, Notice how the number of alerts went up by roughly 600 to 71,938. But now consider a couple of scenarios. These records up top with the green shading represent a series of transactions which, by processing rules and deriving analytics, I'm able to tell that these were conducted within a certain window of time. They have account numbers that link back and forth to each other in terms of where the money is moving from and to. And I'm also able to decipher that the ultimate beneficiary of this group of transactions is Hofstra University, which, by the way, happens to be on the list of accredited educational institutions in the United States. Using these rules, I am now able to attach a risk score to all of these transactions to be low, with the reason code of saying this is an educational payment. And even more importantly, I'm now able to give all of these records a single identifier so that they can be bundled into one single case, rather than being 4 individual cases. This is how I can now consolidate those 71,000 odd cases that I originally had down to a much more reasonable number. Now, the flip side of that, look at what happens when there's malicious or potentially malicious activity, where you see a number of small dollar amount transactions. But by nature of what I have done as part of my party resolution, I know that the individuals in these different accounts where the money is moving back and forth really belong to one single identity. So could this be a potential case of money laundering? I don't know yet. On top of that, I do notice that this gentleman, Kane Marco, has shown up on some kind of OFAC sanctions list. Therefore, for multiple reasons, my rule base tells me that this group of transactions constitutes a high risk and gives it a much higher risk score. And I've also been able to consolidate these 5 transactions down to where now if I add up all these amounts, it blows the $10,000 SEC rule in this situation. Therefore, I have exceeded a limit. So what I've done here is I have been able to identify a network of one or more identities or individuals perhaps that are violating a rule when you look at them in combination. And I'm also consolidating all of these once again to bring down the number of cases and therefore investigative burden. Last but not least, we have here a quick solution ROI calculator. Obviously, a true ROI will take a lot more variables into consideration, but this is where you can use this screen. Allow me to adjust the zoom level once again. So this is where you engage the customer in dialogue. So you're moving out of presentation or demonstration mode into talking about the customer situation, where they might give you the parameters of, that was too much. That's another tip. Make sure you only zoom in or zoom out to as much as you need. So the customer might tell you, well, for this particular book of business, I'm looking at more like 5 million transactions. And you can simply type in those numbers. And you know what? The number of alerts that I generate is more like 150,000 each week out of those. And we're doing a fairly good job of consolidating some of those alerts into cases. Let's call them 100,000 cases. And you can see those numbers changing. So what it basically does is it does some simple math, and you can basically run down this dialogue, fairly self-explanatory, and encourage the customer to give you values that are more realistic to them, to at least now start discussing how a solution like this might very well have the potential to pay for itself. Last but not least, if an architect is present with you at the meeting, you could go to the architecture slide or page of the site where it explains the current situation. Now, depending upon the distribution that you have chosen, Cloudera, Hortonworks, or MapR, this graphic will automatically pick up on it and show you technology that is relevant to that distribution. This is the present state, Mr. Customer. Your operational data is basically can be boiled down to party account transaction. You're using some transaction monitoring system today. Your case management system may also be using some external sources like we have talked about, list of accredited institutions, OFAC sanctions list, other kind of terrorist watch lists, etc. Once again, the next and previous buttons here. So this one's running on Hortonworks right now, so there you go. So here we have, we use our ingestion framework, and these are the components of the Hortonworks distribution that we use. We perform party resolution with assistance from capabilities from our partner Pitney Bowes. Our data and analytics expertise performs event management and pattern analysis, all in a very metadata-driven, configuration-based manner that eliminates programming. And ultimately, our ingestion/delivery framework is able to provide the results of this analytics and therefore this intelligence to the transaction monitoring system so that its rules can be far more effective, and also aids the case management tool by consolidating alerts down to cases. Thank you for your time.